Here is the sound of the Kapyong Valley on the night of April 24th, 1951, when by every rule of that war it should have been silent. A gunner of the 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, stands behind a 25-pounder field gun on the valley floor, some kilometres south of Two Dark Hills. He is not a boy. He learnt his trade in an older war, and he knows the arithmetic of a defensive fire task the way a watchmaker knows the inside of a watch. Range, bearing, charge, the cold weight of a shell going into the breech. What he does not know is how to explain what he is hearing. He is hearing bugles in the dark. He is hearing whistles, thin and deliberate, passing from ridge to ridge along the high ground to the north. He's hearing a sound like the hillside itself has come loose and begun to slide, a low shuffling murmur that will not stop. When the flares climb and burst above the slope, he sees that it is not empty, it is crowded. It is coming on, and it is coming on in waves. He tries to make it resolve into something he understands. He counts the muzzle flashes and loses the count. He listens for the shape of one attack, and hears instead attack folded inside attack. He reaches for the vocabulary of the last war, and the vocabulary will not stretch far enough to cover it. Pause on that. On a professional soldier who cannot find the words for the thing in front of him. Because this is not, in the end, a story about how many Chinese soldiers came down the Kapyong Valley in the spring of 1951. It is a story about why numbers, on those two hills, on that one night, were not enough. Let me be careful with the record as I go, because Kapyong has hardened into legend over the years, and legend files the corners off the parts that matter most. Where the sources disagree, I will tell you so. First, I have to make you believe the enemy's worldview, because if he looks like a fool, then none of what these men did means anything at all. To understand what the gunner was hearing, you have to go back, not to the opening of the offensive, but to the winter before it. In late 1950, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had crossed the Yalu River into Korea in enormous strength, and it had done something that almost no one in the United Nations Command had believed possible. It had taken a modern, mechanized, air-supported army and driven it into the longest retreat in American military history. And it had done this, in the main, with foot soldiers. That is the fact to hold on to. The Chinese did not win their first victories in spite of having no aircraft, few trucks, and little artillery. They had built an entire way of war around those absences, and it was brilliant. Their method ran roughly like this. Move at night, when aircraft are blind. Carry almost nothing, so that you move fast and leave no supply column on the roads to be bombed in daylight. Probe along the front until you find the seam, the boundary between two units, the unwatched valley, the flank that nobody is quite responsible for. Push small groups through that seam quietly, then pour strength through behind them, swing wide and deep and cut the roads in the enemy's rear, so that his forward units, still facing the wrong way, wake to find themselves surrounded and their line of retreat already gone. Numbers were never a substitute for skill in this system. Numbers were the instrument that the skill played. By April 1951, the stakes were understood at the very top of both armies. On the United Nations side, General James Van Fleet had only just taken command of the 8th Army. Facing him, in command of the Chinese forces, was Peng Dehuai, and Peng was about to commit everything he had to the road to Seoul. Seoul had already changed hands 4 times in this war. It had fallen to the Communists, been retaken, fallen a second time in the winter, and been clawed back only weeks earlier. Everyone in that valley understood that if Kapyong gave way, the capital might change hands a 5th time. On the night of April 22nd, Peng launched the largest offensive of the entire war, the 5th Phase Offensive, and committed 3 field armies totaling around 700,000 men. And at first it worked, exactly as it had worked all winter. Holding the northern mouth of the Kapyong Valley was the 6th Division of the Republic of Korea Army. On the night of April 22nd, the full weight of the Chinese attack came down upon it. Within hours, its forward regiments had come apart. Radios fell silent. By the small hours, exhausted and frightened soldiers were streaming south down the single valley road, and behind them the road itself, the road that ran through the central mountains toward the capital, lay wide open. You can hear how smoothly the machine ran in the words of the men who stood in its path. Robert O'Neill, who wrote the official Australian history of the war, recorded that the defenders understood within hours that they were facing an experienced enemy, performing what he called a well-practiced routine, excellently supported by accurate fire from their own 60mm and 81mm mortars. A Canadian war correspondent named Bill Boss filing from the scene, describe the whistles and the bugles, the concerted movement on the word of command, the massed assaults following one after another in swift succession. So concede the point, honestly and completely. The Chinese assessment of that valley was not the assessment of fools, it was rational. It rested on a method that had beaten far larger and far better equipped forces for 5 straight months. The problem was never that their reasoning was wrong inside its own frame. The problem was the frame itself. The method worked until, on 2 hills above a cold river, it ran headlong into something it had never been built to digest. Here is the thing that broke the model. It was not a wall of men, because the Chinese had more men than the defenders could ever have matched. It was a system. On April 23rd, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was ordered up the valley to plug the gap that the Korean collapse had torn open. The brigade was commanded by Brigadier Burke, and it was a strange, mixed, hard-bitten formation. It had fought its way almost to the Yalu the previous autumn, and back down again through the winter, and it had learned this enemy the expensive way. Burke had a front of about 7 kilometres to cover, far too wide for a continuous line, and nowhere near enough men to hold one even if he had wanted to. So he did not try to hold a line, and that was the first decision that mattered. He concentrated his strength on the high ground, around the point where the Kapyong River met a tributary stream. On the eastern range, on and around Hill 504, he placed the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson. On the western hills running up to Hill 677, he placed the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel James Riley Stone. The largest feature in the whole area, a hill called Sudok San, he was simply forced to leave empty. There were not enough soldiers to cover it. Whoever held these hills would command the valley floor, and whoever commanded the valley floor would command the road. Around those 2 battalions he arranged the rest of his improvised force. The 1st Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, 2 companies of American heavy mortars, and down on the valley floor, 15 Sherman tanks of A Company, 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion, under Lieutenant Kenneth Coke, an American armoured company that would fight beside the Australians and cover them for the length of the battle. But the beating heart of the whole arrangement stood well behind both hills. There the New Zealand gunners of the 16th Field Regiment had brought their 25-pounders into action, and their commanding officer had already shown, only the day before, the exact discipline that the coming night would demand. During the Korean collapse, with small arms fire falling into his gun area, Lieutenant Colonel Moody had twice pulled his guns out to save them, and twice brought them straight back into action. Now those guns were registered on fixed points all across the valley, their crews standing ready to drop a curtain of steel onto any patch of ground, the instant a forward observer asked for it. And this is the mechanism that the whole battle turned upon. A Commonwealth company that found itself surrounded did not have to fight its way out. It could stay down in its holes, get below the level of the ground, and call the pre-arranged fire directly onto its own position, trusting the trenches and trusting the gunners' mathematics to do the rest. The attackers, upright and moving in the open, would be cut to pieces. The defenders below the ground would live through it. That is not a theory. That is precisely what happened on Hill 677. As the assaults built through the small hours, the forward positions of D Company of the Patricias were on the very edge of being overrun. Their company commander, Captain Wally Mills, then made the coldest decision that a soldier can make. He ordered his men to the bottom of their trenches, and he called the defensive fire down directly onto himself. The New Zealand guns answered at 2 rounds per gun per minute, the attack in the open was torn apart, and the men in the ground held their hill. I will give you the historian's caution here because it belongs in the record. Some accounts credit Lieutenant Mike Levy, commanding a platoon inside that same company, with actually directing the fire that night. The paperwork of a battle fought in darkness is never perfectly clean. What no one disputes is that a Commonwealth position deliberately brought artillery down onto its own head and survived to hold the line. Men like the Patricias on that hill and the Australians on the ridge across the valley from them are remembered for exactly as long as someone keeps telling what they did, and not 1 day longer. If this account is doing right by them, a single tap on the like button carries the story of Hill 677 in front of a few more people. It costs you nothing, and it matters more than it should. Now step back from the 2 hills, because the deeper question is not what these men did. It is why they, of all armies, were able to do it. They were not the larger force, they were not the better equipped, and most of them were not lifelong professional soldiers at all. They were something else. The Patricias holding Hill 677 were in large part volunteers of the Canadian Army Special Force, a body raised specifically for Korea, ordinary Canadian men who had simply put up their hands. Ferguson's Australians were a mixture of regulars and veterans of the Second World War who had gone back into uniform. These were citizen soldiers, tradesmen and clerks and farmhands, men who had learned their soldiering in a hard school and who carried it without fuss. Consider one of them. On the Eastern Spur, commanding C Company of the Australians, was Captain Reg Saunders. He was a Gunditjmara man from Western Victoria, and he was the first Aboriginal Australian ever to be commissioned as an officer in the Australian Army. He came from a family that had already given its men to the country's wars at Gallipoli and on the Western Front long before him. He had fought in North Africa, in Greece, and for a year as a hunted survivor behind enemy lines on Crete. His brother Harry had been killed in the fighting in New Guinea. At Kapyong he led a rifle company through one of the hardest actions of the entire war, and afterwards he said something very simple about it. He said that at last he felt like an Anzac. Set that one sentence against the country he would go home to, a country in which his gifts as a leader would go largely unwanted for years, and you begin to understand what these men were and what was owed to them. But courage on its own does not explain the outcome, because the Chinese soldier climbing that hill had courage in abundance too, and he paid for it in full. What the Commonwealth had that the enemy could not match was integration. It was the habit of several small nations and their allies fighting as a single connected nervous system. Australian and Canadian infantry on the hills, New Zealand guns behind them, British infantry, American armour and American mortars filling the gaps between, American aircraft overhead. When the Patricias were at last completely cut off and surrounded on Hill 677, American transport aircraft, the big twin-boomed machines that the troops called flying boxcars, came in low and parachuted ammunition and food and water onto the position, so that surrounded men could keep on fighting. And running underneath all of it was a culture in which a junior officer or a sergeant was trusted to make his own decision in the dark, without waiting to be told, and in which the reflex was to hold the ground rather than to leave it. And here is the number that carried the whole thing. Across that single night, firing in support of the Canadians on Hill 677, the New Zealand gunners of the 16th Field Regiment fired something close to 10,000 rounds. That is the figure Robert O'Neill sets down in the official history. 10,000 rounds, from one field regiment for one battalion, in the space of a single night. Stay with that for a moment, because it is not a casualty count, and it is not a tally of the dead. It is an industrial fact. It is the sheer metronomic labour of trained men lifting and loading and firing shells into barrels grown too hot to touch, hour after hour in the dark, until a thin scatter of trenches on a Korean hill had been turned into a position that flesh and courage alone could not take. Now understand why the enemy could not simply copy this, and why the reason was built into who they were. The army that came down that valley was superb at what it did, but its greatest strength was also its cage. It moved on foot and by night precisely because it could not depend on trucks and radios and massed guns the way its enemy could. Its supplies came forward on the backs of men, and a supply line of that kind cannot feed 10,000 shells into a single night of fighting. Its attacks were rehearsed in advance and signalled by bugle, because it could not conjure fire out of the air on demand. You cannot bolt a modern artillery system onto an army that has been designed to travel light and to live on almost nothing. The very thing that made the Chinese method so deadly on the approach march was the thing that left it nearly helpless in front of dug-in men with guns at their backs. If your father or your grandfather served in Korea with the Australians or the Patricias or the New Zealand gunners, I would be grateful to read his name and his unit down in the comments. That is one of the very few ways that a memory like this actually stays alive. The Chinese commanders came to understand the arithmetic of that valley, but they came to understand it too late to change the result. The formation that came south was the 118th Division of the 40th Army, and it was a formation of roughly 10,600 men. Against it, spread across the two hills, stood a Commonwealth force numbering fewer than 3,000. On paper, it was no contest at all. First, the division struck the Australians on Hill 504. Through the night of April 23 and on into the following day, the assaults came in, wave after wave, over open ground and into interlocking fire. At first light, the men of A Company, under Major Ben O'Dowd, found that the enemy had infiltrated right in among their positions in the darkness, and they threw them off once more with a counterattack at close quarters. When a distant American headquarters, believing the worst had happened, radioed to say that the Australian battalion had been wiped out in the night. O'Dowd's answer passed into the memory of the battalion and stayed there. He told them that he had news for them. He was still there, and he was staying there. I am not going to pretend to you that the Commonwealth defence was flawless, because it was not, and the honest version of this is far better than the polished one. Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson's headquarters had been placed too far to the rear, out of proper contact with his forward companies at the very moment they most needed him. At the height of the fighting, an order to pull one Australian company back off a low hill beside the river let the Chinese seize that ground and turn it against its former owners, firing into the flank of the men still holding on. The bayonet charge sent in to take the position back, led by a young lieutenant named Len Montgomery, was as costly as it was brave. A strike of napalm called down onto the enemy fell instead among the Australians, and in the end the 3rd Battalion could not hold Hill 504. Late on April 24, with its position no longer tenable, it fought its way down off the hill, covered as it came by the American Sherman tanks on the valley floor. Say it plainly and without flinching. The Australians were pushed off their hill, and yet the road stayed shut because the moment the full weight of the division shifted across onto the Canadians on Hill 677, the method finally shattered against the system. Again the bugles came out of the dark. Again the whistles passed along the ridge. Again the massed infantry climbed up into ground that had already been measured and registered by the guns, and again the shells came down exactly where they were asked for, and exactly when. Let one soldier stand for that whole night on the hill. Private Wayne Robert Mitchell from the town of Virden in Manitoba, of 6th Platoon. As the assaults broke over his platoon, Mitchell took up his Bren gun and went at the attackers on his own 2 feet, firing from the hip, charging into the rushes to break them apart and to drag cut-off men back to safety. He was wounded twice in the doing of it, once by shrapnel and once by a bullet through the chest, and twice he refused to be evacuated and went back to his gun. By daylight he could barely stand for the loss of blood. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Close by him another Patricia, Private Kenneth Barwise, fought his way across to a machine gun that had been lost to the enemy, took it back by hand and carried it to his own platoon, and for that he was given the military medal. These were not supermen, and I will not dress them up as supermen. They were a rifleman and a machine gunner, doing, under a pressure most of us will never imagine, the exact thing that they had been trained and trusted to do. The Chinese had been right about a great many things that spring. They had been right that numbers and darkness and surprise could beat a better armed enemy. They had been right about the seam at the Korean division, and right to drive hard for the open road. What they had been wrong about was smaller than any of that, and far more stubborn. They had been wrong to assume that men on a hill with guns behind them would break, when these particular men, on these particular hills, had quietly decided that they would not. So come back now to the question the gunner could not answer in the dark. Why could 10,000 Chinese not break 2 Commonwealth battalions standing across the road to Seoul? The Chinese measure of that battle was mass, and movement, and the raw courage to keep climbing up into the fire. The Commonwealth measure was the metre of trench, the registered gun, and the flat refusal to leave it. One side counted the war in men delivered onto the objective, the other counted it in fire delivered onto those men. The Chinese staked everything on the seam, and the flank, and the friendly dark. The Commonwealth staked everything on the hole in the ground, and the shell that would arrive the moment it was called. On the one night that the two systems met in full, in a valley northeast of the capital, the second answer was the one that held. It held, and precision is its own form of respect. So here are the numbers exactly as they stand. The Australians of the 3rd Battalion lost 32 men killed, 59 wounded and 3 taken prisoner. The Canadians of the 2nd Battalion lost 10 men killed and 23 wounded. The 118th Division was left broken as a fighting formation. Conservative estimates put its killed and wounded at around 2,000, and estimates are all that they are and should be held lightly. When the Patricias looked out over their own ground in the daylight, they counted 51 enemy dead among the positions. On April 26th, the 2nd Battalion was relieved, and the great offensive that had opened only days before with the promise of the capital was, on the central front, finished. For their stand, 3 units, the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, the 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and a company of the 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion, an Australian, a Canadian, and an American unit standing together were awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation. It recorded that the seriousness of the breakthrough had been changed from defeat into victory by the gallant stand of these soldiers. I owe you one last admission, and I would far rather make it than hide it. The gunner standing behind his gun at the very start of this account is a composite. He is drawn from the New Zealand batteries, but he is not one single named man, and I will not pass an invention off to you as a document. Everything after him is real. Bruce Ferguson and his hard night. Ben O'Dowd, who would not accept that his company had ceased to exist. Reg Saunders, who asked only to feel like an Anzac and had earned it many times over. Jim Stone, who said, long afterwards, that the plain truth of Kapyong was that nobody panicked, that the front had broken everywhere, and that his was the only battalion still holding on their whole side of Korea at the time. Wally Mills, who called the fire down onto his own head. Wayne Mitchell and Kenneth Barwise, who did the rest of it with a Bren gun and a machine gun taken back by hand. They deserve to be more than a footnote at the bottom of a half-forgotten war. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More hills that had to be held, more roads that could not be given up, and more men whose names should not be allowed to quietly disappear.